Okay, thank you, Deidre, and thank you to everybody at North Star for inviting me tonight to talk about botanical art and also the technique that I use to create it. So it's my hope that those of you who haven't spent much time creating botanical art might want to consider dipping your toe into this genre after seeing this presentation. And to those of you who do create work in this subject matter, hopefully this may offer some new techniques to supplement your botanical art making. So what I'd like to do is go on to sharing my screen. Okay. All right. So, whoops, I'm going a little bit too fast here. Okay. Okay. So for those of you that may have access to Instagram or might have an Instagram account, I am on it. And I will be doing a live demo this Sunday, 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That will probably be 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. your time. And if you follow me, I do postings to indicate when I'll be doing other demos. Typically, I do demos during the winter months. On the summer, I'm out doing plein air and doing all things floral. So I only do these in the winter months. Is Deidre, no, you didn't mention it, but it's a good thing I got the slide up here. I am a member of the American Society of Botanical Artists, which is an organization that's national. And I went onto the website last night and I discovered that there is a chapter in your area. So if any of you are interested in joining, this is the information. You could contact Linda Lufkin, and the website is below. Deidre, I don't know if you want me to give this presentation. Oh, but we'll be recording it, so I guess it's a moot point. And the other thing that I noticed from their website is that they have member studio sessions, and they're monthly, which is pretty cool. From what I recall, from what they described it, they said that everybody gets together and they share one another's work, or they'll have a work session. So I thought that was really interesting. I don't have anything like that here in New Jersey. So you guys are very lucky to have access to this. So this is the agenda for tonight. So I'm going to do this brief presentation, basically just to give you all my motivations as to why I do what I do. I'm going to review the art supplies that I use, give some specimen care tips. And when I talk about specimen, I'm talking specifically floral, botanical specimens, brief explanation of my process, a demo, and then a Q&A at the end. So if you could all just hold your questions to the end, I'll be more than happy to answer them. I don't know why my thing is not advancing. Okay, there we go.
There you go.
Okay. So a majority of my career has been spent in front of the computer. And this is the primary tool that I use for teaching, and it's the primary tool that I use when I do my own graphic design. It came to a point in my career after doing this for approximately 10 years and staring at a screen all day that I discovered that my ongoing hunger to feed my fine arts soul needed to be satisfied. And it turned out that watercolor painting proved to nourish this need. I decided to use subject matter from my childhood that had the ability to transport me back to when I was a young child. Every summer until I entered college, my siblings and I spent a few weeks up at my grandparents' farm up in Roxbury, New York. My grandparents grew just about every vegetable that you could imagine. And the property also boasted several fruit trees, blueberries, and strawberries. In the fields in early spring, you could forage for gooseberries. In August, huge wild blackberries could be found. And it was basically a produce paradise. And not unlike most children, I didn't really appreciate the incredible taste for the food or the freedom that afforded being able to run around barefoot in an environment like this until I was an adult. At my childhood home, our garden wasn't as grand, but it did offer seasonal botanical eye candy. Spring would usher in the bloom of tulips, hyacinths, forsythia, and bridal veil, and there were pink dogwood and saucer magnolia trees. In May, lily of the valley, purple and white lilac, rhododendron, and azalea bushes would continue the symphony of color. Vegetables were planted in May, always on Mother's Day. We always had a working Mother's Day for the purpose of sustaining us through the summer till the first autumnal frost. And beginning in June, my mother toiled over a dozen different tea rose plants so that we could have fresh cut roses in the house every week. So when the day came for my husband and I to purchase our first home, a patch of soil for growing pretty much anything would fit the mandatory requirement for me. While I don't have enough room to grow an arsenal of veggies, I do have enough space for seasonal plants that bloom from March till October. And that is any hardcore gardener's wish, is to be able to exploit the season by extending it as long as possible, so that, especially for our flowers, so that you have continuous colors. Living in New Jersey, also known as the Garden State, offers a plethora of locales with historical buildings and period gardens. Very, very lucky to have this all within a short drive from my home. And these are just a few of the places that I frequent to observe the life cycles of plant species that I can't necessarily grow at home. For instance, the Reeves Reed Arboretum, which is down here in Summit, New Jersey, starts usually around the end of April and into May. They have this amazing area that is all full of daffodils, all different species. And it transports you back to being out in a daffodil field somewhere out in like maybe Europe. Then there's the Presbury Memorial Iris Garden. That's to the far right. They have approximately 50,000 irises. Not 50,000. I'm thinking of the daffodils. They plant 50,000 bulbs every year, or have 50,000 bulbs planted. The Presbury Memorial Iris Garden has over 84 different types. And it's just amazing to see when it's in full bloom. So there were two approaches when I embarked upon doing watercolor painting again. The first approach, I haven't abandoned totally, but I've just kind of put it on hold for the time period. And you're going to see that there's a radical difference between the two. So in 1989, I saw a retrospect of Georgia O'Keeffe's work at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And up until this time, I had never really thought about her work in relationship to its physical size, simply because I had seen a majority of her work in books. That's why it's always important to go to museums, because books don't really do a lot of work justice. So as a result of going to this exhibit, I experienced an eye epiphany. For me, the exhibit presented a different perspective on how to view flora. It also gave me permission to think about working larger for the purpose of having a botanical form, color, and texture take up the entire field of vision. Prior to this, I never worked this big, so this was a big deal for me. And even though the work is still fairly tight, it's big enough that it gives me still the capability in some areas to remain a little bit loose. So this is a part of a series that I've been working on for a few years called Abstraction Series, where I'm really obviously zooming in on the subject matter. And in some cases, if you take it out of context and, don't look at the title, sometimes you kind of have to pay a little bit of a guessing game to figure out what it is that you're looking at. All of these are on cold press. So in the summer of 2013, I was doing research for a series of lectures for a design theory and criticism course, and I came across some seed packages dated from around the 1930s. These small colored lithographs were just amazing to me. They beguiled me. They became a visual gauntlet that would lead me toward changing how I approached my subject, overall workflow, and the medium itself. I'm still pretty amazed at the seed packets. I've started collecting them. I just think that the attention to detail is just amazing. And it's a shame today that a lot of the seed manufacturers or seed companies rather have abandoned using artwork for their plants and vegetables. They're using photography. So instead of filling the entire field of vision with the subject, I now pulled back and acknowledged the importance of working with the white space. Instead of avoiding it, I tried to exploit it for the betterment of the depicted subject. And I was never, up until this point, a big fan of hot press paper. I learned quickly that embracing it aided the process in depicting the level of detail that I desired. I've always built my layers of paint through glazing and wanted to take a similar route with the hot press paper. I found that colored pencils and watercolor colored pencils married well with giving me the fluidity of paint with fine drawing characteristics. For me, the challenge is not just the accurate depiction of a plant or flower, but how to convey the spirit of the organic subject within a sometimes intimidating white space compositionally. It's interesting because with the first approach, composition was very easy for me to establish. With this approach, it's a lot more of a challenge, and I still struggle with it sometimes. Okay, so that's just a tiny little photograph of sort of like my work area, very similar to what I'm going to be, what my work area looks like tonight. So full disclosure, the objects, the supplies that I'm going to be reviewing, I'm not getting any money for endorsing them. And I gave Deidre a more detailed art supply list than what, whoops, let me go back. Okay. All right. So this is sort of like the bare minimum of supplies. These are the supplies that I recommend my students to get for my workshop. And I also have, after this, nice to haves. So I primarily use Faber-Castell Polychromos pencils. Those are the regular colored pencils. And then I marry them with the Faber-Castell Albrecht Dürer watercolor pencils. The hot press paper that I use is Legion Stonehenge. And I'll tell you, it's an amazing paper for this technique. It can stand up to a lot of glazing. It's incredibly reasonable. I tested a lot of papers before I found this Stonehenge was able to give me what I want. And more importantly, I'm able to lay down some nice tonal areas believe it or not, hot press paper, unless you use colored pencil, normally when you paint on it, it gets absorbed and you don't see any kind of texture necessarily. But when you're doing work like this, it can be turned into a big hurdle if you don't have the right kind of paper. And then I've just recently started purchasing Winsor Newton sable brushes, the Rolls Royce of brushes. And as you can imagine, they're not cheap to have, but their performance is exceptional. They have excellent water retention. They can hold an exceptional point, and they have really good snap. And for those of you who might not know what snap is when the brush responds by rebounding quickly as you put on downward pressure applied to a surface such as paper. As a personal choice, in order to extend the life of Winsor Newton brushes, I don't use them as a rule on cold press paper, simply because I'm concerned that it's going to wear away the brush. But there is a brush that I do use for cold press that I'll be talking about. Okay, so why Faber-Castell over other brands? First off, it has a lower wax content. Just about every colored pencil that's manufactured today has a little bit of wax in there, and what it does is it keeps the hue that's inside the core of the colored pencil stable. It also will allow you to apply watercolor to it, which is great. It can be erased if you haven't pressed too hard onto the paper. There have been occasions where I've been able to pull up a significant amount of the colored pencil. Of course, this is prior to putting the watercolor pencil on top of it. And the other thing that's really pretty wonderful is the fact that the hue matching is spot on. There are some other colored pencil manufacturers that have got regular and watercolor, and I've noticed that when you activate the watercolor, the hue is a little off from the regular colored pencil. For me, that's a big problem. It should match, and Faber-Castell does a really good job of that. Again, the paper that I use, and I always use it in watercolor block form. Smooth surface, stands up to multiple layers of colored pencil and watercolor, and it's very reasonably priced. The alternative brush that I use, and that I also recommend to my students when I teach, because I do teach introduction to watercolor painting classes, is the Robert Simmons Blue Sapphire brushes. They're, I believe, the only manufacturer of brushes out there that do a blend of natural hair and synthetic. So you're kind of getting like the best of both worlds. And I use them exclusively for cold press watercolor paper. I do use them on occasion for plein air work when I'm doing my botanicals in plein air, because I don't like to take my Winsor Newton brushes outside into the field. And the weird thing is that I'm noticing that there are some, I've heard rumored that they're going to be discontinuing this line. I've been noticing that some of the brushes are kind of like going away. So if this is something that you're interested in getting, I would highly recommend that you get them before they're all gone. Now, these are the nice to haves, and I'm going to go through each of these. 3 of these can be purchased through Amazon. The Crandash palette that you can get from Dick Blick, and the agate burnisher you would have to get from Etsy. You would just basically go into Etsy and just, in the search function, just put in agate burnisher and you can find it. So I do not use electric pencil sharpeners. In my opinion, they chew up the pencils. And the other thing that they don't do is give you a really good point. And you will see when I'm doing my demo that the points that I get, especially out of this manual pencil sharpener, are pretty amazing. It does a really good job of taking the wood away from the hue and having a killer point on the end of it. This palette, what makes it so unique is that it's plastic, and the top part of it where you would put either watercolor or your watercolor pencil on it has got a texture to it. And what you do is you take the watercolor colored pencil and you literally scratch the surface of this palette, and it kind of is sort of like, you know, acting like sandpaper, and it holds the hue on the palettes, and obviously you can use it for mixing, which is really great. Paint puck, I love this thing. I found this last year. It's really cool. First of all, the top kind of looks like a daisy. This total paint puck cup can get disassembled. You can take the top off and the bottom off. I haven't tried putting it in my dishwasher yet. It is made out of silicone. Because what ends up happening is as you use it, it starts to get stained with the watercolor. So it starts to look kind of trashy after a while. But the amazing thing about it is around the edge of it, you can insert your brushes. So brushes that you're not using, you can just stick in there, and it's great. And then obviously on the bottom of it, it's got this textured surface that will allow you to release any paint in your brush to clean it out. So I just love, love, love this. Okay, agate burnisher. Again, I'll be demoing this, and this is primarily used over time because I'm building up layers of colored pencil and watercolor pencil. What happens is that I start to get a little bit of flocking from the paper. And what the burnisher does is it basically pushes down the texture of that flocking back into the paper again. And this is a burnisher, from what I understand, that is used in gold leaf application. I just got this lamp last week. Amazing. It's fairly reasonable. LED. It comes with different levels, dimming feature, and then also you can change the color temperature of the light itself. More importantly, what I love about it, I won't be doing it tonight, but I typically have an easel. And what's nice about this lamp is that you can set up an easel underneath it. You won't have the light shining in your eyes. It gives you a wonderful wide area of light, and it does a pretty good job of simulating daylight, which we don't always have the luxury of having daylight available to us when we want to work. All right, so these are just some tips that if you're planning on doing this, that I've found to try to extend the life of the specimens that you're going to be using as your subject matter. And like anything, time is not a friend to botanical artists. We're always racing against it because we're working with something that is living, and it's still growing. Even if it gets cut, it's still going to grow, and eventually it's going to die. So if you go to your local supermarket or florist, the first thing that you should do when you get home is recut your stems, and make sure that you have a very sharp knife. The one thing that you don't want to do to your stems is you don't want to bruise them. So avoid scissors, because if you pinch the stem, it's going to discourage that plant or that flower taking up water. And what will happen is you risk it wilting. You want to avoid direct sunlight. Again, sunlight is going to age your specimen, and of course, excessive heat. You want to change the water daily, simply because you want to try to keep the bacteria down to a minimum in the water. And then there are some botanical artists, believe it or not, they have separate refrigerators or space in their refrigerators to put their specimens in to again extend the life. Obviously, you would have to do a little bit of research to see if your specimen can tolerate being refrigerated, because not all specimens can do that. And then more importantly, you want to keep stuff away from your food that potentially is poisonous. And then not unlike anything, I am always taking tons and tons and tons of photographs. So typically what happens is that when I arrive with a specimen that I really like, I will set it up in different compositions with either a white background or a flat background in daylight, and take enormous amount of photos for reference. Because I don't always have the luxury of doing my botanical art in the moment. So I rely upon photographs. So I'm going to be doing a demo of tulips. And one of the things that you can do with tulips, because tulips, gosh, if you can get 6 days out of a bunch of tulips, not even 6 days, what am I saying, like 4 days out of tulips, that's pretty good. So what I do sometimes, especially when I'm doing workshops, I have to buy my tulips in advance, because it's not much fun to like be drawing a tulip that's all closed up. So what I do is I buy them like 2 days ahead of time, and depending upon where they are in my home, they may decide to open up all the way. So to kind of suppress that, I just take some fishing line and just tie it around the bloom, and it kind of like suppresses them from getting any wider with their opening. Okay, so preliminary work, sketching and color matching. So this is something that I encourage my students at the university to do, my students in my workshops to do. A lot of individuals, especially if they're beginners, if they're taking classes for the first time, don't understand that, like any craft, you need to practice. And the best analogy that I can give is I usually ask my students if any of them have ever learned how to play an instrument. And if you have, you know that if you want to be proficient in an instrument, you have to practice. Well, it's the same thing with your art making. And a way of doing that is to do observational sketching. So I try to do as much observational sketching as I can before I start my what would be considered final composition. And especially if it's a specimen which I haven't spent too much time with yet, from all different angles. And also the great thing about that is that it also forces me to really look to see how that flower grows, how the petals are connected, how the stem is connected, and the leaves and sizes and relationships. So I encourage, if you don't do observational sketching, think about maybe doing that with some of your work. Again, prior to executing my drawings, the final drawings, I always, before the specimen dies, do my color palette and matching. Because and especially in natural light, I don't ever do this in artificial light. So you'll see in a little bit, I have, there are times where I mess up quite a bit. I do not throw out the drawings that I've messed up on. What I do is I save on those pieces of paper, and I flip the paper over and I tear them up into strips, and I use those strips as my palette testing for my colored pencils. And you'll see here, I've got little scratches of rectangles indicating the separate hues, and underneath it, those numbers correspond to the number that is printed on the colored pencil. Again, the advantage to doing this is that if I want to work at night under artificial light, I know ahead of time to use these specific hues to achieve as close as possible, the matching to the original subject. This was something that I did during COVID, which I needed to do because I have tubes and tubes and tubes of watercolor paint. So I, decided it's about time for me to do my own color charts, and it has been invaluable. So this particular set of color charts are on, these are the ones that I use for when I paint on cold press paper. So you obviously have to do the color chart on the paper that you're going to be using. And I've got next to each of these swatches, the manufacturer's name and the name of the hue. And as a lot of you probably all realize, manufacturers have got different interpretations of what Prussian blue is. So that's why it's important to do these charts. All right, so this is the step-by-step process that I use that I'll be going over tonight. So after I do my observational sketching, and I like to do a nice final drawing, and that final drawing is all line. There's no tone in it whatsoever. And I'm basically looking at the form of the subject. I'm trying to nail down my proportions. I'm trying to figure out my composition. So once I get that line drawing done, I will trace it. And obviously, the tracing has to get flipped onto the reverse side and has to get retraced, because what I want to do is I want to transfer that tracing onto my watercolor paper. I never, ever, ever use graphite pencil on my watercolor paper. And I'm talking about physically drawing on it in graphite. I only transfer my tracing, which is done in graphite, onto the watercolor paper. So once I get that tracing done, flip it over, I rub it. For those of you who are of a certain generation, if you remember carbon paper, okay, this is sort of like graphite version of that. And then I don't want necessarily that graphite drawing to be very prominent. So I will go in with a kneaded eraser and I may remove some of that graphite, but still have enough information there that I can then springboard off of to start executing in colored pencil. So the first thing that I do is I map out my tonal areas, specifically my shadow areas and some of my midtones. I always use cool colors. Shadows are cool colors. They're not brown, they're not black. They're cool colors. So we're talking about our purples, our blues, maybe even greens. So this is the first step in trying to get all of that noted. Then I start to apply my watercolor pencil. And I only do a thin layer at first. And as you can see, the colored pencil that I put down is starting to change a little bit. It's starting to take on a different characteristic. Now, the next step, in order for me to go to the next step, I have to make sure, and this is something that's very important, after you apply the watercolor, and I'm going to say watercolor in general terms, because sometimes I do pull hues from my physical watercolor tubes that Faber-Castell might not have. So whether it's either from my watercolor tubes or my watercolor colored pencil, you have to make sure that after you apply it, that the paper is completely dry. Because if it isn't, and you go in there with your regular colored pencil, it's going to rip the paper. So it's got to be dry. And the great thing about hot press paper is that it dries really fast. So now with the paper dry, I start to apply my regular colored pencil to refine out my tonal areas and details. The watercolor paint would then be put on top of that to start to bump up the saturation of the hues. And then I kind of alternate in different levels. There might be an area, a large area that I might want to have a very even tone that I might decide to put a little bit of watercolor versus the colored pencil. So again, this is built up as alternating. And then this is the final, one of the final tulips that I've done. So for tonight, what I've done, so this is fairly typical of me getting a bunch of flowers that are opened up beautifully, and I don't have the time to sit down and draw them. So what I did is I took a whole bunch of photographs, and then I brought those photographs into Adobe Photoshop and figured out, oh, I like this blossom. I like this blossom. Oh, wouldn't that blossom look great with this one? And I've basically sandwiched them together into a composition. I don't always do this, but in this occasion, it just happened to work out that way. There are some flowers that I don't have to put several and go into Photoshop and do all of that. But just so that you can kind of see that this is an option. And then, you know, erased stuff that I don't need. There's an area in here that you'll see the top blossom is kind of missing a stem. And there's a little bit of an overlap of a leaf. You know, hey, this is the great thing about being artists. We can be godlike. We can change reality a little bit, you know? So I'm going to extend that stem, take out that leaf, just to improve the negative space and the composition overall. So what I do is I then take the photograph once I've queued it up, got it all ready to go, and I put it on my iPad. And I will have my iPad like right next to me, and I'll be looking at that for reference. So I guess now, Deidre, we can go to my phone.
Okay. Let's see here.
And I'll stop sharing my screen. That probably would help, right?
Maybe. Let's see. Trying to.
So this is actually the edge of my iPad. And I'm using a first generation iPad Pro, the very first one that came out. I'm still using it. It's a couple of years old. I love it, love it, love it. Okay. All right. So I always have a piece of paper towel in my hand. If I screw up, I can blot. But more importantly, I use it to blot off any excess water from my brushes. So here is the palette specimen that I've created that has got, excuse me, my swatches with the corresponding numbers on them. Oh, and also, a lot of times I don't want to have a brush that's fully loaded with pigment. So what I will do is just do a little bit of a test on this paper as well, because I don't want to work too dark. So you'll see during the course of the demo that this will get full of little patches of color. Tracing paper, strips of tracing paper. You will sometimes see botanical artists will have like a sheet of tracing paper with a hole cut in the center, and then they will move that sheet around. Doing this particular genre of botanical art, the one thing that you have to try and do is keep your white background, completely white. You can't have a speck of paint or anything on it. It's got to be as pure as the driven snow. And I use the tracing paper to cover up areas, also to lean on so I don't do any smudging. So this is the composition that I'm going to be working at. And you can see that what I've done is I've actually done various steps that I showed in the presentation. So underneath this is my graphite drawing. There's hardly any of it left because I've pulled up most of it. So in fact, I'm noticing, I don't know what happened over here. Use my kneaded eraser. I got something smudge over here. So this is basically the first layer of regular colored pencil, which I have done to all of these blossoms. This one has it, but you can't see it because I've got watercolor and regular colored pencil already on top. So you'll notice again that it starts to go away and it starts to change. This is the next step where I've applied a thin layer of watercolor colored pencil. This has got a combination, obviously, of this, and then regular colored pencil that has been applied as well. And you can actually kind of see that this is a little bit kind of spotty. So that spottiness that's occurring with the watercolor, I can even out with the colored pencil. Okay. So let me show you the palette. So this is my palette. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to load up my palette with a little bit of, oh, I know what I wanted to show you guys. So when you purchase the polychrome Faber-Castell colored pencils, this is actually the Albrecht Dürer. I don't know if you can see that. Okay. Just to show you the difference between the two. Is this glaze as well? Yeah, okay. So this is the regular, and this is the watercolor. And what Faber-Castell has done is that they've changed the shape of the pencil. Let me see. Okay. One is circle and one is an octagon, so that you don't get them mixed up. Also, the watercolor pencil's got a little brush on it so that you can tell the difference. So when you originally purchase them, they come with this kind of point. And for the watercolor, it's okay. But for the regular colored pencil, this is a pretty wimpy point. The point you want to have is this. Okay, you want to have a killer point like that to work with, because it will give you the flexibility for detail and getting nice even tones. And I am a real stickler with my students that if I see something getting down to this, I go nuts. It's like sharpen your pencil. Okay, because this is not going to give you the tonal areas and the details that you want versus this. All right, so for the palette, so again, this is my regular, this is the watercolor pencil. I'm just going to scratch it on the palette, and it's going to remove the hue, and it's going to hold it on that palette so that I can just activate it with water. And again, I also put regular watercolor on here. There are occasions where I just put a little dab on there. I had a student many years ago. She was a neat freak, and she would wash her palette at the end of every watercolor class. I was like, do you realize that you're throwing away money? She's like, but I like it nice and clean. I'm like, yeah, but there are colors on there that you can use from painting to painting to painting, and you're just, it's going in the drain. So this is one of the sapphire brushes that I was talking about, the Robert Simmons. For my classes, I recommend that they get a number 4. And the 4 is a very versatile size. It's a round. It does a really good job of, getting some nice large areas and also some detail areas as well. So I'm going to switch over actually to one of my Winsor Newton brushes. And I didn't graduate into Winsor Newton right away as far as sable. I started with Raphael's. Raphael's are pretty good too. So because I'm going to be working on this blossom, I'm going to use my tracing paper. And I'm not going to use a whole lot of water, a minimal amount of water, just to activate it. You see that? Not a lot. Now, here's the thing. Because this hue is basically being ground up on the palette, it's kind of grainy. It looks a little bit like sand. So what you have to do is when you activate it with the water, you kind of just have to tease it a little bit to dissolve it. Now I'm going to use my piece of paper here just to test this. This is kind of dark, so I'm just going to dip my brush into the water just a little bit. And that's pretty much what I want. And then I use my paper towel. I use Bounty paper towel. I love Bounty paper towel. It's great. So now I'm just going to go in here. And I am, moving my head, looking at my paper, looking at my subject as I do this. I do not stare at my watercolor paper and paint because the information is in that photograph and I constantly have to look at it and check to make sure I'm putting down the stuff in the right place. Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm dipping my watercolor brush back into the water to kind of just push some of this paint around and also soften my edges. For those of you who work in hot press paper, you know that hot press paper is not very forgiving when we're talking about our edges. It dries really fast, and if you don't soften your edges right away, you're going to have a hard edge. Unless, of course, you paint like John Singer Sargent, who I revere. Okay, now I'm going to take pigment off of my paintbrush, and while this is wet, I'm going to use my paintbrush, damp paintbrush, as a tool to push this little bit of paint around. And again, this is the great thing about these Kolinsky brushes, is that they hold the water. They've got good spring back. They're terrific. Again, I'm just going to put a little bit there, take the pigment off my brush, take a little bit of water off of it, and then push this around. So the point of doing this is to depict these tulips so that, number one, they look like tulips, but more importantly, to try to capture the spirit of them. I'm not looking to create a work of art that looks like a photograph, because I would just take a picture and use, that is my work of art. I'm looking for something that's got some soul. This particular blossom has got, this one had a lot more orange on it, so I went all over with it. You know, each one's different. So I'm going to start using a little bit of some yellow because this has got some yellow on the top here. So this is going to give me my base of hues. Here. I mean, it's hard, I'm sure it's hard to tell from the video, but you know, I really still have pigment on this brush that I can go in all these different areas. Okay, so I'm going to let that dry. You're probably beginning to see that the purple, because the colored pencil that I originally applied is actually is it called light red violet, is starting to recede. So now I'm going to go onto this blossom and I'm going to start using my regular colored pencils. Okay, let's see. With my 17. Okay, so find what I'm looking for. There it is. Okay. So I am a frugal artist. Art supplies are very expensive. So there's a thing, I don't know if for those of you who may draw, probably you know about pencil extenders. I actually got these on Amazon. And what's wonderful about them is that when your colored pencil or your drawing pencils start to go all the way down to here, don't throw them out. Get a pencil extender. I've been known to like get it all the way down to here. When I can't fit it in my my pencil sharpener anymore, then I have to abandon using it. And yes, Faber-Castell colored pencils are more expensive than the competing brand that everybody uses, which is I'm sharpening my pencil here. Prismacolor. They're about a buck more, but again, in my opinion, they're far superior. Okay. All right. So one of the things that I always check is after I always use this pencil sharpener, and I don't always remember to do this, I always check because sometimes there'll be some hues that'll be like little shavings or whatever. And if that drops onto the paper and I don't realize it and I go against it, it's going to ruin my background. So I always blow and get it off my pencil tip. Okay, so I'm going to start out, and I actually have a little crumb here that I didn't get off. I'm going to pick up with my kneaded eraser. So this is a gradual process. This is not a technique that you're going to rush through. It is time consuming, but you know what? That's the great thing about art making. We can lose ourselves in it. We can forget about the craziness outside and try to be a little at peace. Again, when I do my workshops, I always have to repeat during the course of the workshop over and over to my students and tell them the goal is not to finish your drawing. The goal is to learn and retain the information so that you can go home and you can maybe finish it, because I always encourage them to take pictures. They also take their flowers home with them. Because you can't rush this. You have to take your time. Especially with this particular medium, because if you rush, what inevitably happens is you're not going to be happy with the results. You're going to get frustrated. And that's not the goal. The goal is not to get frustrated. Okay. God, it is really pouring outside. I have the window open. I have the window open, people, in June. Yeah, January. Feels like June. I mean, it actually it sounds kind of nice. It sounds like one of those soundtracks from the app Calm. I don't know if anyone uses that app to go to bed at night. So I'm just going in here and I'm kind of, adding a little bit of this red. I am not putting any pressure on this paper. I am literally just dragging the pencil across, and you'll notice that there's going to be two types of strokes. Ooh, a little bit of thunder. I hope that the electrical gods we don't lose power. Because whenever I hear that, I'm like, oops. It has been known to happen. So I'm just dragging this across the paper and letting the texture of the paper take the hue off of the pencil. I am not putting any pressure on this. Because again, if you get too dark too soon, you're not going to get the results. That you want. So you will see that I'm going to start to add also a little bit of some details in the petals. So this is one type of stroke that I use to do tone. I do cross hatching. And I also do circles. Teeny weeny little circles. And the thing about the circles is that I don't stay in one place very long. I move around. How am I doing on time, Deidre? I have absolutely no idea where we're at.
It's 8:08, so you have at least 20 minutes.
Okay.
And you can certainly add another 10 to that if you'd like.
Okay. See, that's the thing. Don't you notice that when you're doing your art making, you lose all track of time? It's wonderful.
Yes.
It's wonderful. Okay. So again, now you can see how I went from this to this to this. Now I'm going to go over to this one, and I'm going to try to finish this petal a little bit. What I try to do is work the whole composition, because if I like finish this petal, finish that petal, da 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 da. No, work the whole composition, because you don't want to overwork an area. But for purposes of demonstration, I'll try to finish this petal so that you can see what a finished area looks like. So again, I'm using the same hue. And I'm going to try to even out this tone, because it's kind of, I don't know if you can see it, but it's kind of spotchy. So there are occasions that when you put on watercolor, colored pencil, or just watercolor, you might get some spots, not an even tone. So that's where the regular colored pencil can come in and correct that and fill that area in. And that's why it's also important that when you're applying the watercolor, that you don't get too dark. Now I have to sharpen this because it's not as sharp as it could be. I'm trying not to move the camera or the phone. The other thing that you obviously, as I stated earlier, I'm just dragging this colored pencil across the paper to have the hue transfer or the pigment transfer. If you press really hard, this point's going to break and it's going to shoot across the paper, and that'll be the end of it. And that's another reason why you need to have a light touch. Which is hard if you're working so tight, if you're working, and rendering something that isn't fluid, it's kind of hard to kind of loosen your grip a little bit. Okay, so I'm just want to go in with my orange glaze, and then I'm going to apply some watercolor pencil.
Heidi, what would you do if you got color in a place where you didn't want it? Would you adapt the blossom, or is there a way you would remove it?
This stage, I can take some of this pigment up. In fact, I'll even show you. I can erase. See that?
Okay.
Not completely, but enough. But when I get to this point where I've got watercolor, I've got regular colored pencil, it's a little bit more difficult to pick stuff up. So yes, you would have to adapt. I don't know if I have it within arm's reach. I had done a drawing of the classic red orange poppy a year or two ago, and it was going really well, and I was so excited, and I put it down, and then the next morning I looked at it, and there was a like a 10% little teeny weeny little drop of watercolor on the white background.
Mm,
And I was like, oh God, what am I going to do? So I still have it on the back burner, and I'm trying to figure out putting maybe another blossom that's closed in the background. It happens. You know, I'm not the only one that this has happened to.
mhm.
You just got to figure it out. Okay, so let me go into this. So now I'm going to start defining some more details with my regular colored pencil. So obviously I've got more control over putting these indentations in my flower petal, at least for me, than I would if I used a 000 brush. There are some artists out there, they're able to do it, God bless them. But I don't have the control. It would freak me out.
Mhm.
This is my deal. I feel more comfortable doing this. So it's the same principle that you do with watercolor painting. You work from light to dark. Same thing. If we were doing oil painting, we would work from dark to light. You know, mapping out your highlights, where you're going to pull back and not put as much pigment. Now, I think I'm going to start to go in with a little bit more darker red. And I'm going to do it with pigment. So a lot of you are probably saying, well, why didn't you do that to begin with? Why didn't you just go right in and make it really dark and whatever? Well, because, and I know it's kind of hard to see on the screen, or if you go to my website, you know, see photographs, but there's sort of like a luminosity to the way that the watercolor and the color pencil are working together, that if you get real dark, you kind of miss out on. And by building it up in layers, it just adds a real nice characteristic. Now I got to be careful. I can't keep painting over too much over the same area, because then it's going to make the paper too wet. We don't want to create holes. So now we're starting to get a little bit of dimension on that petal. So I'm going to leave that. That's going to dry. I do not use hair dryers. I know that there are some watercolor artists that have their handy dandy hair dryer by near them. That's great, but I don't do that for this. I just let nature take its course. So I guess I'm going to wait for that to dry a little bit. So I do want to, however, want to show you the burnisher. So this is what it looks like. This is actually agate, which is a mineral. And what you would do is you would take the flat end, and you would just literally, see if I can do it in an angle so that you can see. Without any pressure, just go over the area where the texture of the paper is starting to pop up a little bit. And that's all you do. Obviously, you would have to wait for this to be completely dry before you do that. I actually stole this idea from a very well-known botanical artist in England. She showed it on one of her demos. It's like, what a great idea. Okay, so I'm going to shift. This is still a little damp. I'm going to shift over to this area. And Deirdre, you just jump in when you need me to.
All right, you have another 10 or 15 minutes easily.
Okay. Why don't we do this, Deirdre? While I work, I can take some questions.
Okay. Lainey has a question. When you were talking about the different kinds of colored pencils, she asked about Caran d'Ache pencils.
Yes. Honestly, I'm not going to lie. I haven't tried them simply because I've been very happy with these. And they're also very expensive. They're more expensive. At least I know that the artist grades, I think they may make a student grade than the Faber-Castell. So I can't really definitively give you a critique on them, but I can tell you that I recently purchased Holbein colored pencils. They are also more expensive than the Faber-Castell, and I'm just starting to work with them. They will work with watercolor. So I mean, it's a possibility that I could maybe supplement, because the cool thing that they do have is that they have got some really unusual hues that Faber-Castell doesn't make. So I'm just dipping my toe using the Holbein.
Okay.
And so far, so good.
And on the same topic of pencils, you said that the pencils are numbered. Does that number relate in any way to pigment value that would be on a tube of watercolor paint?
I think it's just the manufacturer's way of keeping track one hue from another.
Okay. So when you're trying to match actual paint, if you were going to use any paint on that, you would just do it by eye?
Yes.
Okay. Marilyn is asking, would you, I just lost it, hang on. Would you rinse your brush before blotting water out to move the water around?
Yes. So when I'm pushing the brush around to, soften edges, that brush has got no pigment in it and it's damp. It doesn't have a lot of water in it. I'm just basically using it as a tool to soften edges and push existing pigment that's already on the paper around.
Judy, do you want to ask yours?
Heidi, when
Yes.
you made the little circles rather than strokes, what benefit does that have?
It's just a different way of applying tone like I'm doing it now. And when I stated earlier that this particular paper has got like a minimal texture to it, it still has a texture that you'll actually see like teeny weeny little holes of white. And by doing the circles, it kind of fills it in a little bit.
Thanks.
Sure.
And Marilyn is wondering, what weight hot press do you use?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. What is it? 140 pounds.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, this is 140 and this particular pad is 10 by 14. So the colored pencils, the paper, the brushes, I get everything from dickblick.com.
Okay.
I am fortunate enough that I have a Dick Blick store about 25 minutes away. So I can get my paper and my pencils there, but I cannot get, they don't sell the Winsor Newton brushes in the store. That I order online. But I pretty much have topped out. I think the largest Winsor Newton that I have is, this is it. It's a number 6. How much did I spend on this? I think this was $60. So this is going to go in my coffin. Bury me with my brushes.
Do you do any kind of a value study before you begin?
Yes, there are occasions where I will do a value study of something that I'm, not too familiar with. If you go onto my Instagram feed, you'll see that there are a couple of value studies that I've done, sketch, of some work.
And just to refresh my mind, the process you use is you draw in that purpley violet color. Then the first step is watercolor pencil or regular?
I would say about 90% of the time it's the watercolor colored pencil.
Okay.
Obviously, if it's a hue that isn't available through the watercolor pencil, then I'll supplement with regular colored pencil.
Okay, and then after you do that coat, then you would add regular colored pencil to deepen and delineate shapes. Is that right?
Yep.
And then you go back on with watercolor again
Yep.
to kind of soften edges and
also because here's the thing about the regular colored pencil, you can get dark, but you can't get real dark. And that's where the watercolor can kind of help you out also with saturation. Like you can see in here where I had just applied the watercolor and was waiting for it to dry, and you can see how dark it's starting to get a little bit.
Mhm.
But what I also have in here, and I don't know if you can see it on the camera, but there's a little area that is not very solid and it's not unifying the tone. So I could go back in again with watercolor, but here's the thing, as great as this paper is, you can't do like 20 layers of wetting
Right.
it and re-wetting it, because it's just, it's going to get to a point of no return. So that's why the colored pencil, and I'm going to fill in that little area, comes in handy to unify and to help the transitions of the tones as well. So it's sort of like, you know, the colored pencil is really good for some things, and the watercolor supplements what the colored pencil is lacking in.
Mhm. So I would say if someone was going to try this, it would be time well spent to just have a piece of hot press paper and just practice the strokes, you know, to get the right firmness or lightness to it.
Yeah, I mean, you're going to definitely want to, you're going to want to practice your mark making. That's important, but that's, you know, no different than if you were just working with graphite pencil, you
Right.
know, practicing your mark making as well.
Lainey is asking if you've ever used Daniel Smith watercolor sticks.
No, but I don't know if you'd be able to get a real,
No.
that's a good point. I don't know. I'll have to think of that. That's a good suggestion. I'll have to try them. I love Daniel Smith paint.
Mhm.
The best two manufacturers that I found that have got like really unusual hues are Daniel Smith and Holbein. Holbein's got some great colors.
I really like Holbein
Oh.
paints.
I mean, I've got this Opera Rose, which is like a Lady Gaga pink. It's amazing. And I love using it when I do peonies. You know, when the peonies bloom, like those really magenta peonies.
Mhm. Does it matter if if you used watercolor paint, does it matter if it's granulating or not? I would think that would really impact the softness.
Well, you know, like I said, you can even stuff out with the colored pencil.
Okay.
If that has, you know, if that has a tendency to be a little bit of a problem.
I'm trying to ask one last question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Do you finish with watercolor or pencil as your final stroke on the paper?
Oh gosh, I never really thought of it. It's finished when it's finished, I guess. Because I'm doing this technique interchangeably, it's kind of hard to tell. All right, so I'm gonna go working on this one a little bit with some watercolor.
And Cecil says that opera color is not color fast.
Yeah, that is true. Yeah, you always have to check that. It's a shame because it's a great color. These are fairly light fast. You know, like anything, you don't want to put this in direct sunlight hanging on a wall. So now I'm getting pretty dark with this.
You are, yeah.
Because this area on the tulip is pretty dark. But notice how I'm taking the pigment off the brush, and now I'm going to use the brush as a tool to push this around to soften my edges. I have a high regard for anyone who works on hot press paper and just does straight watercolor painting. I salute you. Or artists that work very fast, that have got like very energetic brush strokes. And go, and it's a tree.
Yeah,
I think that's fabulous. I don't work that way though. So you notice that, I'm moving around. I'm not staying in one place. There are some botanical artists that do watercolor or gouache on goat skin, vellum, and get some amazing results. Because, when you're dealing with that kind of a surface, there's a real awesome translucency to the material, and it just adds a whole nother dimension to the work. And if you make a mistake, you just use a very sharp penknife and you scrape it out.
do you have to do anything to the finished painting or drawing to fix it? Or when you frame it, do you put glass or plexiglass, or how do you hang them?
There are some, I've heard of some artists that do color pencil work that do varnish it, but I've like any artwork on paper, you're just going to want to make sure that you're using acid-free mats, which are also known as pH, neutral.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can afford good UV glass, I would recommend that. There've been occasions where I've gone to, there's a very well-known international juried competition that the American Society of Botanical Artists sponsors each year. And it's like the creme de la creme that get into it. It is my goal one day. I just want to get into one. And they rotate. They have the exhibition on the West Coast, and then they have it sometimes in the Midwest, and then on the East Coast. And it just closed in December. They just had it at Wave Hill in Yonkers, New York, or the Bronx. And the work is just amazing. And like I said, it's international. So you're getting people from all over the world that are submitting work. And it's all different mediums of botanical art. It's watercolor, colored pencils, oil, oil on panel, vellum. It's just amazing to see everybody work on the different mediums depicting botanical art.
You still painting?
No, I'm watching this. This is from the Watercolor Society. It's their meeting.
I see. I'm gonna sit down here.
I'm gonna hit this with a little bit of color. Bring this up.
Do you think the larger size paper, the 10 by 14, is a good way for a beginner? Is that a good?
To be perfectly honest, the size that I have my students get is this. This is 7 by 10.
Okay.
And it's just enough to start off, to put like one flower, you know? It's not a big investment. And this has got 15 sheets to it.
Okay.
Okay, so this has got a lot of regular colored pencil on it. So I'm going to go in there with watercolor and just make it a little bit more saturated.
Heidi, we have a question from Lynn. She's wondering how botanicals are judged. What distinguishes the best among them?
Oh gosh. I think more than anything, and I think it's like pretty much with any work of art, it's got to move you emotionally.
Mm-hmm.
You got to look at it and it's got to arrest your attention. And I'm talking in broad terms. You know, this goes for realism and abstraction. It's got to arrest your attention. You have to be like, wow, you know, you've got to have that wow moment.
Mm-hmm.
So once you get hit with that wow moment, you will then be judged on depiction of the subject matter and how accurate it is, attention to detail, technique, and more importantly, and here's the difference between botanical art versus, in my opinion, any other medium or any other genre. Your piece has to look good 10 feet away and 3 inches away.
Mm-hmm.
Your edges have to be pristine. You can't have any oopsies in the white background. The transitions between tones have to be seamless. You have to be able to like blow this thing up to a poster size and it's going to hold and not look blurry. Where normally, when we're talking about two-dimensional art that's going to hang on a wall, you usually step back and look at it.
Mm-hmm.
For this particular type of art, it's got to look good from a distance and it also has to look good close up.
Wow. Do they get their magnifying glasses out?
Well, they like, I mean, you know, at the international exhibit, you know, you can get your practically nose to the glass to look at.
Heidi, I'm wondering if you have a book that you've written, or if there are any books that you would recommend, just one or two. I know you have a list you're going to send me, but if someone wanted to go do some exploring this weekend.
Do I have? Let me see if I have something within arm's reach.
You don't have a book that you've written?
No, I don't have a book that I've written. I can write lectures. A book is a different story.
And do you do any YouTube videos at all?
I don't do any YouTube videos, but I may be doing Skillshare. I don't know if any of you have ever gone online to Skillshare. It's something that I'm thinking of dipping my toe in maybe this summer. So this is a book that Botanical Art Techniques. It's a comprehensive guide. It came out by the American Society of Botanical Artists, and it was edited by Carol Wooden and Robert Jess. These two women are like legends. And what's really cool about it is that it explores all these different techniques: watercolor, graphite, colored pencil, vellum, pen and ink, yada, even egg tempera, printmaking, and more. And it's, let me see if I can find a page.
What were the editors' names again?
Carol Wooden Her last name is Woodin, first name Carol. And Robin Jess, Jess.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And let me see if I can find. Okay, so basically it's, it's going step by step on each of these techniques. And I bought it because does anyone want to take a guess what the hardest thing to do is on a flower? Anybody?
The leaves?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah,
Leaves are a royal pain in the you know what. They are, and that's another thing that people are judged by is that if they have a plant that has got very detailed leaves like this, and they do a really good job, they're going to get in that exhibition. Leaves are hard, and
Yeah.
I'm still working on them. I'm still learning how to execute them.
I think in general, most watercolor artists would agree that greens are hard to find the shade, the exact shade that you want is really difficult.
I don't know. I'm thinking more red.
Yeah, red can be touchy too.
especially, and red can be a real chore to photograph because sometimes it can blow out and either be very pink or go in the opposite way where it's too blue
Yeah,
on your camera phone. So I've always, and it makes my husband nuts because my husband, he belongs to a photography club. He's a real camera geek. And I go out with and I have a DSLR, a really nice Nikon, but inevitably when I go out looking for subject matter, I bring my iPhone and I photograph my work with that. I can get pretty close. It averages the scene really well. And then I go home and he looks at my photograph and he's like, I hate you. You did that with your phone, didn't you? I'm like, yeah.
they've gotten to be amazing.
Yeah.
The cameras and phones. Lynn is also wondering, are there some artists that you especially admire their work?
Oh gosh, botanical artists or
Oh,
artists?
any artist.
Oh, well, I mentioned John Singer Sargent, who I revere. And in fact, a new biography just came out, which I want to get my hands on. I spoke about Georgia O'Keeffe. Believe it or not, the first person that I was attracted to that made me really want to think about being an artist was Beatrix Potter.
Mm,
The first book I ever read was Peter Rabbit. And I was just amazed at the illustrations. And Beatrix Potter, she, believe it or not, was a botanical artist. She actually, it wasn't published under her name. It was published under her uncle's name, did some research on, I believe on fungi. And because during that time period, women were not permitted to present papers, she had to have her uncle present it on her behalf. And if you look at some of her illustrations, they do have a little bit of stylistic bent to them, but they have got a collection of her sketchbooks at the Victoria and Albert Museum. You can actually go online and see some of the pages from them, and they're just lovely. Who else do I admire? Oh gosh. Well, Carol Woodin, who worked on that book. Carol Klugman. There's Wendy Hollander. There's a whole bunch of people. The list goes on and on.
and then I think I have a question. We talked a little bit about plein air,
Yes.
doing botanicals. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I know we have several members who love to paint plein air, and even though it's not the time of year where we'd be outdoors painting botanicals, you know, if you got a nice bouquet of flowers, you might want to paint them from real life rather than do the photograph and all that.
Right.
So how would you approach doing plein air painting outdoors?
Okay, so we know that when we're doing plein air, we're scaling back. We're not bringing the arsenal of stuff with us that we normally would have access to.
Mhm.
So the one tool that I do bring with me is this. I do bring this palette with me, but I will limit my hues in colored pencil and regular colored pencil. And I think I might have this on the list that I gave you, Deidre. I don't remember. These are Japanese pencil containers, excuse me, and they're great for the field. You can put your pencil in here, and then when you're getting ready to leave, and and it stands up. When you're getting ready to leave, you pull the top and you zip it up.
Oh, wow.
Isn't that
That's
great?
very cool.
You can get these on Amazon. They're called Delde, Delde. And again, to use it, I'm trying to do this so that you can see it in the camera. Here, I'll do it this way.
I love that it
Pull it
stands up.
down. Yeah. So what I do is when I'm working in the field, I might have these, because I bring obviously a collapsible captain's chair with me. I kind of like wedge them next to my, I don't know, my hips, and then I
Mhm.
just pull from them. So I have, one for my regular colored pencils and one for my watercolor pencils. Obviously a water container. And as far as paper, I would not use anything this big. I would use this size paper.
Mhm.
And I always do a sketch beforehand, just in a regular sketchbook. And I would not bring my Winsor Newton brushes. I would bring my sapphire brushes with me. And to be perfectly honest, the number 4 would be perfect for my purposes. This would serve
Mhm.
all my purposes. Kneaded eraser, definitely the pencil sharpener. Believe it or not, there's a smaller version of this that they make, and that's what I have. Paper towel, kneaded eraser. I think that's it. That's pretty much it.
A pretty lightweight kit.
Yeah, and then because the water block is fairly stiff, I just have it on my lap. I prop
Mhm.
it up. Oh, and what's real important is a windproof artist's umbrella. That is actually the most expensive thing that I have in my arsenal. Trying to remember the name of the manufacturer I have, but you can't sit in the sun and stare at a white piece of paper because you're going to
Right.
get blinded. So you have to be doing it in the shade. And as I've gotten older, I can't take the heat as much as I used to.
Right.
So I'm a lot whiter than I was a couple of years ago. So, and the umbrella that I have, it's got a stake. You can stick it in the ground and you can angle it. And there's just enough coverage for me to sit under it and do what I need to do. And it's windproof. So it's perfect.
Nice. Well, I think we're getting close to wrapping up. If anyone has a last question they'd like to ask, just feel free to unmute yourself and ask it directly. Another couple of minutes and Heidi will wrap it up for the evening.
I don't have today's lottery numbers, sorry, or tomorrow's lottery numbers. Sorry. Wish I did.
Heidi, I'm wondering if you ever make prints of your work, or you know, or is it all, or you just mostly focus on making originals?
I do have stuff for sale, absolutely. There's a website called Society 6, and it's like Society 6. Actually, if you go to my website, there's an area on my website that you can go to, or you could just type in Society 6 and my name, and I sell, oh gosh, what do I sell? I sell prints, all different kinds, like small postcards to like large prints, and they will frame them. I sell greeting cards. The greeting cards are pretty popular with people, and I usually do an annual Christmas card that I send out to friends and family, and then I, obviously put it up for people if they want it. And then another thing that I do, which I haven't done in a while, is surface pattern design. What does that mean? So basically, for those of you who may sew, I do patterns that are printed on material goods. And during COVID, I came out with a line of cloth masks with like reusable inserts, and those are on Vida, VIDA. And again, there's a link from my website to that area as well.
Thank you.
Sure. But no book yet. Maybe when I retire.
Yeah, that's a big undertaking.
Yeah. Anybody have any questions about supplies? Where do you guys go for your art supplies? Do you have someone local, or do people just rely upon online?
We have a couple of Dick Blick stores
Okay.
in the Twin Cities. And one of my favorites is in St. Paul. It's called Wet Paint. And it's right near a college, and started by some former students at that college.
Oh,
And they really have great customer service. It's a smallish store. And they also offer some great classes there too.
oh, that's terrific.
But they have a wide range of high quality materials. Anyone else think of anywhere?
Is it St. Louis Art Supply?
Don't know that one.
They're online. I actually have an art supply store right in my town. Where if I'm not going to Dick Blick for paper, because he doesn't sell, unfortunately, he doesn't sell the paper that I get. But if I need something quick, I can pick it up there. There was a time where there were a lot more like pearl paint. But that's, I think it was mostly on the East Coast. There was a time where there were a ton of art supply stores, and we're located really close to New York City. So in the day, there were at least a dozen that were competing against one
Oh
another.
my gosh.
Pretty much all gone, which is a shame.
Yeah, it's kind of like the independent bookstores have kind of disappeared. I heard they're making a comeback though, so that would be nice.
Yeah, no, they are. And craft stores too are unfortunately kind of going away. Now you've only got like the big chains like Michael's.
Mhm.
And that's another thing, a lot of students, I'm a real stickler when it comes to art supplies, as far as making sure that they get what I indicate and not substitute. A lot of students will go to Michael's and they'll pick up something where they think it's the same thing and it's not, and then it's like, oh. So, and then plus Michael's doesn't always have the best prices anyway when it comes to
Mhm.
supplies. They have a tendency to be very expensive. So I always have a disclaimer that says, if you diverge from my list, I'm not responsible for, I'm not responsible for how your stuff comes out. And I make sure to keep, like I said, I'm a frugal artist. There are some classes that I've seen where they teach colored pencils and they're having students spend something like $60 to $70 just on the colored pencils. And it's like, no. Have them get the basic hues and then have them mix. you
Right.
know? Especially if you're just starting out, you don't want to spend a lot of money.
That blossom you're working on is really starting to pop out now, isn't it?
Yeah, little by little.
Yeah. Well, Heidi, I think we'll call it a night. It's been just, it's
Okay.
almost meditative watching you paint. So thank you so much. And I'd like everybody to unmute and let's give Heidi a round of applause for her wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Heidi.
Thank you so much. It was a
Thank
lot of
you.
fun.
Lovely. And I'll be in touch with you, Heidi, about the finishing up afterwards. So
Okay, and I'll get that book list to you and then you can distribute it to everybody.
great.
Well, everybody, I hope that this inspires you a little bit to kind of, venture out. You never know. You could be doing mixed media, right?
Try something new.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so very much. Good
Thank
night,
you.
everyone.
All right,
Thank
good
you
night,
for
everybody.
joining.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.